Hello and welcome to EPR with your favorite environmental enthusiasts, Nick and Laura. On today's episode, Sam and I talk about wetlands because Laura's voice is gone. We talked to Ben Poulter about grant writing, wetlands, and working for NASA. And finally, from NASA's website, if the Earth were a perfect sphere, its gravitational field would be the same everywhere. But in reality, the planet's surface is bumpy, and water flow and ice drift and the movement of tectonic plates beneath the Earth's crust and all these other fun things change the pull of gravity. These variations are known as gravity anomalies, which sounds like the start of a horror movie. So that makes me nervous. But as we read on, a mountain range such as the Himalayas has a positive gravity anomaly. So the gravity is stronger there than it would be on a lower part of the planet. And conversely, the ocean trenches or dips in land caused by glaciers millennia ago lead to negative gravity anomalies. And I think we've seen the India, there's a spot in the Indian Ocean that has a gravity well. And I saw that in the news recently because I'm a huge nerd. So how about that?
Cool. Scary.
Yeah, it doesn't sound great. But yeah, I love it. Hit that music. NAEP will be hosting its advanced NEPA training virtually on August 23rd from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This workshop will benefit those professionals who work in related natural resources disciplines, who work with federal land management or real estate transactions, federal agency projects or permitting, and transportation or other infrastructure projects with a NEPA review component. Check it out at www.naep.org. Let's get to our segment. So was any of that interesting to you? Any of the interview that really caught you?
Well, when he was talking about their research on if wetlands pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere more than
methane. So like
than methane. And I'm like, well,
yeah.
What does that mean if that proves to be true? Are they just going to be like, let's tear down all the wetlands because they're not doing anything for the atmosphere, but for flooding, sure.
Right. So that would be a balance, right? And this mangrove specifically, I don't think it's definitely not all wetlands, but I think mangrove specifically. Okay. So they would do that though. I mean, there would be like a kind of a balanced equation, right? A lot of times, like there's a stat I heard once where it was like, if the Mississippi River Delta, it originally had 20 million acres, now it has 4 million acres of wetlands. If it had 13, it would almost never flood. And that's one of the things that one of the greatest benefits wetlands have in general is absorbing water. So there is an absolute value there.
Sure. Yeah.
And because there's value to keeping people and infrastructure from getting flooded, there's always going to, even if mangroves do have a net negative, there would be some reason to keep them in there. If there was a way that was convenient or simple to, change the way that system worked, they could, but that's just not how it works. So I'd be surprised, honestly, if they would ever try to remove mangroves, if that were the case. So,
I mean, yeah, me too. I thought that was a funny research. Like, oh, well, what if it doesn't do that well for pulling?
Yeah, I mean, it's really
out of the atmosphere. Yeah. It's like, knock them down.
Get these out of here.
Let's build on them.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. I'm sure people would try to take that as a path. Somebody would somewhere.
I think so too.
Yeah, but I think hopefully that's not the case, and hopefully we won't have to worry about it. But yeah, quite funny for sure. And there's different wetland systems. We were talking about this earlier in the week. There's different, like when you're looking at projects and where they are and how wetlands are related to those things. Different types of wetlands, palustrine, emergent, riverine, all these fun things, all these fun terms and chaoses. They all have different values and they do different things. And it's even strange. We were talking about how it's strange to have a wetland that you can't see it for half the year because it doesn't have water, standing water. But, that's one of the reasons you test for it by putting an auger in the ground. And if you get water in the first 12 inches, guess what? It's wet. That's kind of fun.
Laura just put something in the chat saying there was a news report about Manatee County. There's a county named after manatees pulling back their wetland regulations. So,
right.
Shocker.
Oh, I know. But by the way, just as an FYI for everyone, if you're wondering why Laura can't talk, go ahead, Laura. Go ahead. Say something for us real quick. Yeah, exactly. There we go. She can't. She can't. Her voice is gone. So she's here. But
poor Laura.
I know. And, with the Sackett ruling that has come out, we need to get Fred back on the show to talk about that. But there's a lot of the ruling has been putting emphasis on states taking the lead on their wetland regulations. Now, technically, wetlands aren't protected. Doesn't mean they can't be, but it's going to be state specific. And, one of the challenges with that is that watersheds don't care where you draw a state boundary. And that's a little disappointing because there could be areas where there's a lot of protection and then areas where there aren't, which affects the entire watershed no matter what. So if one state doesn't have regulations upstream, then it's going to impact everything downstream as well. So, it'll be really interesting to see. So stuff like that, where there are regulations being pulled back in different counties and different states, I think we'll see a lot more of that as things go on. Some states will do the opposite and they'll just keep the rules and regulations they have right now, and some will not. And we'll see how that goes out. I think there's always a balance between development and protection, but you go too far in either direction, somebody's going to get upset. And I think that's fair. It's a fair statement to make. And yeah, I wish they wouldn't.
Yep.
But that's where we are. Okay. So
do we want to get to our interview?
Yeah. Let's get to our interview.
Okay.
Hello and welcome back to EPR. Today we have Ben Poulter, a research scientist in the Earth Science Division at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Welcome.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be on the show.
Yeah. So Ben, tell us a little bit about what you do for NASA.
Yeah. So as Nic said, I am a research scientist in the Earth Science Division at NASA. NASA not only does research on other planets and on the universe, but also studies life on our own planet and what sustains life. So part of my role in the Earth Science Division is to understand the biosphere. And the biosphere includes all of the land ecosystems, tropical forests, deserts, temperate forests, boreal forests. And we use a whole range of approaches to try to understand the role of the biosphere on the planet. That includes building satellites that are free-flying around our planet, taking measurements, to developing models that simulate the various Earth system processes on the planet, to going out in the field and carrying out field campaigns where we can make measurements directly. So I've been at NASA for about 7 years now, lead a team of around 10 people, and then have a broader collaborative team of maybe 20 to 30 additional people within and outside of NASA. And have a bunch of sort of field campaigns going on, one in the Everglades National Park, and then extend what we learn in the field to a couple of different satellites that are currently in development. And so I'm happy to chat more about a range of things.
I know. It's almost like I don't even know where to start, right? It's a kind of like there's so much going on there. But I think so. You have a team of 10, you work with 20 or 30 people. So what does your day-to-day work look like?
Yes, so I'm trained as a scientist. I finished on my PhD in 2005. And then I spent around 10 years overseas in Europe, becoming sort of even more of sort of a subject matter expert on the carbon cycle, looking at CO2 and methane fluxes. And then when I joined NASA, I sort of envisioned my career at NASA as continuing the science and sort of testing various hypotheses and making discoveries. And then sort of as sort of alluded to earlier, there's so many opportunities at NASA, and there's a lot of sort of demand within NASA for people to get involved and take leadership on various topics, that I found myself growing a large team of scientists to help carry out a lot of the activities. So day to day, it's a real, every day is different. It can consist of just sort of administrative tasks, emails and signing documents to make procurements and things like this. But it can go all the way to being out in the Everglades National Park and being involved with collecting data on mangrove systems. And in this case, while we have an airplane flying over, making measurements of the greenhouse gases, the CO2 and the methane that's recycled by the mangrove ecosystems, to finding oneself at what we call sort of a mission concept discussion where we're meeting with systems engineers and experts on engineering, brainstorming and working through studies on how to make measurements from space for a given technology that they'll have the expertise in. So every day is different, and we try to connect the dots through the goals that NASA's Earth Science Directorate has for understanding how the planet works.
So cool. So how do you decide, so you're like, okay, we're going to fly over mangroves and look for methane. How does that come to be? There's got to be some, I guess, background research and institutional knowledge you're using. But when you decide, okay, this is what we're going to do versus something else, like how does that work?
So the way I try to connect the work that my team do is through the guidance that NASA gets from the National Academies of Science. And so every 10 years, the National Academies carries out decadal survey. Decadal survey is a series of recommendations of what NASA should be doing to understand the Earth system in this case. And there's an equivalent decadal survey carried out for astrophysics, planetary science, and heliophysics, the other science divisions that we have at NASA. And so when we carry out the science activities, we have to have traceability back to the questions in the decadal survey, which are as fundamental as what sustains life on our planet. How does the climate system work? Then there'll be subcategories sort of within those very fundamentally sort of high-level questions that we then fit in the various research projects within. So my job is interesting in terms of how I get paid. So I'm a government employee, so I'm a civil servant. But at NASA, part of the expectation for raising one's salary is through grant writing and receiving grants. And so I actually sort of like this because it provides an opportunity to consistently sort of be thinking about new ideas, new collaborations with people, and then competing for these grants to raise the money to do the research, but also to cover my salary. So a project like the Everglades would fit under the decadal science, the decadal survey questions around the carbon cycle. Mangrove ecosystems are arguably sort of the most productive ecosystems on the planet next to tropical forests. And there's a lot of interest in whether we can regrow and restore mangrove ecosystems to suck out the CO2 from the atmosphere as part of a climate mitigation approach. But at the same time, mangroves are producing methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And so part of the study that we're doing in the Everglades is to figure out, well, are they removing more CO2 than they do release methane? And what's the net climate benefit of restoring mangroves?
Okay, that's the coolest. That is like literally the coolest. I love that. That's really awesome. And so, sorry, I'm gushing a bit, but that's really neat. I appreciate the explanation there. And I think, do you like grant writing and like having that almost be like, there's a significant incentive for you to do it. You've got to be good at it, right? But do you like doing it as well? Because those are obviously two different things.
I find grant writing stressful. So it's not, obviously there's a lot of pressure, but at the same time, it's sort of refreshing. It's a way to sort of get situational awareness on a topic and to sort of brush up on the literature to sort of better understand, where the field currently is, where the gaps in understanding are. And so, we, on sort of an average year, we're writing, at least sort of like a half dozen proposals a year to the various NASA grant programs. And then I collaborate with colleagues who are leading their own proposals. So it's a big, it's sort of like a consistent thing that's going on in the background is developing proposals. And then these proposals have, roughly like a 10 to 20% chance of success. So there's a lot of rejected proposals while the process is happening. And so that's, I think, partly why I sort of overcompensate by writing more maybe than is needed.
Yeah.
But the other thing I love about the opportunities we have at NASA is that we can collaborate with colleagues at the universities, at other federal agencies, at nonprofits. We have a project with the Audubon Society right now looking at how satellite data can help inform bird protection for migratory bird species. And so we're sort of providing expertise on the different types of satellite information that might be useful for bird habitat modeling. So the grant writing, sort of keeps you on your toes and then keeps you flexible in terms of choosing who you want to collaborate with.
Yeah. And it's funny. So it's a lot of what I do is really similar. And there's it's not necessarily grant writing, but it is proposal writing. So I understand the stress. I can feel the stress, it's a very fair thing. And, when you're in school and when you're trying to get to, follow your career path, you don't always think about like the small things you learn along the way.
Right.
But learning how to write well is one of the best skills that like people that I look for. That's one of the biggest things I look for in people that I'm working for. So for you, what do you look for with a prospective hire or a prospective student? What are the most important things for you and your team?
Yeah. So for team building, although you made me think about sort of being an undergrad where I had one professor where we had to produce, I think it was like a 3-page essay once a week. I think it was like junior year of undergrad. That was really painful, but I think that I remember that class. By the end of it, I was like, I can write now.
Right.
And then I remember, then I think then I also remember another professor who, I think a lot of people go into, my undergrad degree was in forestry. And so I just had sort of visions of being like, someone like Walden and sort of like hanging out at a pond. And,
right.
But I remember early on, a lot of faculty would say, just because you're getting a degree in forestry doesn't mean you're going to just go off in the woods and sort of be by yourself. They were like, a lot of this job is about communication and either through writing or through public speaking and so on. And so that was sort of drilled in early on, but and it's surprising how correct they were.
Yeah.
So hiring. So I finished my PhD in 2005. And like I said, I worked overseas for about 10 years. I had a brief sort of stint as a professor at Montana State University. And then the position opened up at NASA. And I've been there for 7 years now. And I sort of, from my perspective, just think about how lucky I am to have had such incredible experiences and been able to sort of find those experiences. And again, I can remember as an undergrad not having the slightest clue of sort of what job I was going to have in my career. I knew what I was interested in, but I had no idea what the job options were at that age. And my parents worked in advertising. I didn't have any. They didn't go to grad school. They were supportive, but they sort of had limited firsthand experiences to share with me. And so sort of thinking about how clueless I was about where I would end up, and just sort of like how amazing the career has been so far. Yeah, it sort of affects how I make decisions about how I recruit people and the approach that folks take. I'm very open to folks sort of taking a risk and being sort of unconventional in terms of how they approach me to look for work or get ideas about job openings and so on. So this means meeting people at conferences, having people, send that random email and say, hey, I read one of your papers or I saw a quote from you, or, I saw you while I was searching the NASA website or whatever, and reaching out is something that I respond really well to. And I'm not sure how unique that is amongst my peers, but I think I have a pretty good track record of responding to almost every email that sort of comes my way. So I would say sort of like this unconventional, sort of approach of just taking that risk and reaching out and sort of seeing where it lands. So that's sort of one perspective I have on this.
Yeah. And it's great to hear that. And I think a lot of people, there's an intimidation factor with somebody you don't know, but it is true. I think a lot of times it's just taking the risk. It's a really good way of stating that, right? It's like, just if you're interested, then ask about it. It seems very simple, but I know there's a lot of emotion behind it. And so, so management styles, right? So you have people, you have your team, and how would you even say, how do you motivate your team? How do you get work done in an efficient manner? Because it's really easy for those projects to kind of stretch out and the scope and scale of things to change. So how do you manage your staff, and how do you manage those projects? Yeah,
it's amazing how when you start a project and you just sort of have, a checklist of steps that you're going to go through. And then, 6 months later, you're just like, two.
Yeah.
So the folks, folks on my team include everything from undergraduate and graduate interns through, sort of like mid-career scientists. So we had 2 interns this summer as part of NASA's internship program. At Goddard in the Earth Science Division, for example, there were like 70 interns, I just learned earlier this week, that went through the program. I think NASA-wide, it's obviously in the hundreds and higher. And they're incredible opportunities to sort of get involved in any of the aspects of NASA science or engineering or project management. So we have interns, work with a couple of grad students at universities doing PhD level work, and then I have some postdoctoral scientists, sort of 1-2 years out from their PhDs. And I think sort of a common thread that I like to think I have is sort of being able to empower folks on the team so that they feel comfortable taking initiative and also feel sort of more motivated to sort of carry out the work under their own momentum rather than being sort of like pushed to do something. But it's a difficult trade as a manager because people are going to make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. Or people are going to go in a direction that might not be sort of the direction that I had in mind previously. So a lot of the approach requires good communication, transparency, and sort of being open about whether the management style is working or not working. So I would say I like to think that I'm sort of providing opportunities for folks to feel empowered on the team. I also like to do my own research when I have time now. So sort of giving that empowerment sense to people on the team helps move the projects along, equally.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? It's one of those things that, like, you mentioned, management and where you are, and there's absolutely a shift in your mentality when you're doing some of the work like hands-on in the field, and then you shift to a more management style. Was that a hard transition for you? Was that something that, like I say, it's great to you still keep a piece of the project's work as well with you as a manager. So was it easy to give up some core responsibility to take on new responsibility?
No. I find it really, I find it hard. I mean, I love, still sort of like, downloading data and writing code and, making the figures and doing the whole stuff and the whole flow. And so, so it's tough to sort of move away from that and find more and more of my time on the administrative side of things. But I mean, I was fortunate again, like I had, early supervisors, mentors that were able to balance things and set sort of a good example of, at least sort of like set it up such that you could continue doing the science as you sort of moved into the management. But it is hard, and it is sort of a struggle because, as you move, beyond sort of mid-career stages, the career development sort of ladder goes into that management realm more than it does enabling doing science. So. Right.
Yeah. And it can be a hard transition for people. So I think, but it's great. It's like, it's really good to have a balance, right? You still want to have that edge, that sharp edge, knowing, hey, this is how the field work goes. This is how these projects go. And you kind of keep that institutional knowledge sharp if you're still doing some of it, even if you're not doing as much as you'd like. So that's really cool to hear.
Yeah, I mean, some people, I need that like hands-on sort of experience to stay sharp. But I mean, there are other people who are able to stay just as sharp and not need that sort of hands-on stuff. But no, I find, I need to sort of get in the field be sort of, looking at the bits and bytes of data to really make all the connections.
Yeah. And, and it's totally fair and absolutely right. And I think, with that too, one of the things that we do on the show is talk about our field notes experiences. It's like hashtag field notes as our tag right. to, we talk about what you do in the field and those fun and memorable moments. And I'm sure we could spend the whole show talking about just your experiences in the field, but give us an example or two of some fun and memorable field experiences that you've had.
All right. So I would say the last decade or two, most of my work is behind a computer. And then, but the Everglades Field Campaign is quite new. We set that up 2 years ago. And so I've been on a couple of the trips down the Everglades. But prior to sort of sitting behind the computer, there was a lot of field work that I was doing with colleagues and friends. One of sort of the most memorable was when we were out in these swamps in coastal North Carolina where there's these trees, the Atlantic white cedar trees grow. And somebody had published a book on eastern old growth forests. And there was a chapter on sort of like where you would be most likely to find old growth trees. So my colleague, my friend, and I, we got a small grant to go out to this preserve in, I think, like Hyde County, North Carolina. And we were going to core these trees with an increment borer. So it's just a small sort of tube that you screw into a tree and then extract the wood. And so we got down there and we took, we get into this swamp, park the car. And obviously it's a swamp, it's wet, and there's a lot of like ditches and it's a lot of brambles. And so we took the path of least resistance to get to these massive Atlantic white cedars that were like several feet in circumference. And so we core the tree and, it would have required like, at least like two like grown adults to sort of hug the tree. That's how big it was. And we core it and we take out the core. We counted the rings and it was like 60 years old. So it wasn't old at all. And it was just like, an artifact of like how productive these systems were. So we sort of like hung out, like got a bunch of trees cored and it was the same situation for all of them, which is pretty disappointing.
Oh yeah.
And then decided, then the sun was setting. It was winter. So it was sort of chilly. Start to head back to the car and look at the GPS, which is, like a direct route, and we hadn't GPSed our least resistance path in. And so then after like, 20 minutes of trying to get back, we were like stuck in these brambles and in a bit of trouble because it's getting dark. It is cold. There's no cell phone service. And my friend takes out these like pruning shears and starts sort of clipping individually.
That's funny.
Yeah. So we eventually sort of made it out. I ended up just sort of like charging through the vegetation. And that was sort of one of my last field trips.
No reason, right?
It was like, okay.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah.
But we've, so that was a good one. But, it's like a lot of my PhD work was in coastal North Carolina in sort of the brackish marshes on the coastline behind, on the inland side of the Outer Banks. So this was an area where there were like black bears and alligators and snakes and things like this. It was also sort of incredibly hot and buggy place to do work. And so it was a cool place to be doing research because not many people had done research out there because it was so sort of rough to work in. But it made me, I was sort of happy to make that transition to more computer-based stuff. I mean, now I'm sort of rambling, but, early on, I did a lot of field work as an undergrad, working with the Forest Service. And field work is hard. I mean, I can remember sort of like standing on this mountainside where my colleague, we were counting the number of dead and live pine seedlings, I think it was. And, it was raining. And there were like several thousand pine seedlings that we had to count over the course of like 5 days. Yeah. And it was just like, I had this old fashioned sort of like calculator thing. And he would just be like, dead, alive, dead. It's like 5 days of this.
Right.
So I think it's rewarding, but it's also, I think fieldwork can be tough.
Oh yeah. Gosh, the people you're with matter too. And, gosh, we had a guy that just couldn't help himself, but always found like the worst place to go. I'm like, Dan, what are you doing? Like, can we just go around the brambles, please? So, oh man, that's so fun. And so I love that you had your experience in coastal in North Carolina and then decided, now I'll also work in Florida, which is also just, if not worse, Oh, that's too funny. But you also spent a lot of time overseas as well. And you've done a lot of work in Europe. So I guess you have a lot of perspective from a lot of different places. How do you use what you did out in Europe and what you do today?
Yeah, I mean, so if you haven't noticed, my accent is a little bit strange. So I was born in the UK, and then when I was a teenager, we moved to the US. So at the end of my PhD, I was interested in going overseas and getting some more different perspective on things. But I had no idea sort of where to begin looking for how to get a job overseas. And So I would sort of sit on the internet, like Googling stuff back in 2005, like, terms of, research terms and sort of like countries and see what matched.
I love it. That's
good. And then I would email, folks sort of out of the blue and be like, hey, I've read your paper. This is what I'm interested in. And so one guy wrote back, actually. Yeah. So I remember now. So then one person wrote back and from Zurich, Switzerland. So one of my former mentors, and he was interested in some of the ideas that I had. And so then I think like the following week, I hopped on a flight from North Carolina over to Zurich to spend like 3 days with them. And this was, I think the flight was like $300 from like the US to Zurich at that time. And it just sort of got, things were more expensive too, but I think there was just some weird, so I was able to sort of get out there and stay at a youth hostel. And we wrote a proposal together that got funded. And I think, the thing with Europe is that Europe has had, 30 years of consistent climate policy, where there's been the recognition that, humans are causing climate change, and that climate change is having, was projected back then and is now having really severe impacts on society and ecosystems. And then there's been a very clear connection with the science and of climate change and the policies that are needed to stop climate change and reverse the impacts. And so things like net zero emissions, how much CO2 we can continue to burn to avoid exceeding 1.5 or 2 degrees warming is all sort of, very traceable back to the science that's been done. So what I really appreciated about the approach that's taken in Europe is that a lot of the funding for science is traceable directly to policies that are being used for mitigating climate change or for any sort of range of topics. Like it's very focused. And in the US, my perspective is that a lot of the funding is sort of more, there'll be a very general topic, and then it's sort of like a bottom-up, sort of grassroots approach in terms of how the science community competes and puts together proposals. And then the other thing I sort of learned working in Europe was that a lot of the funding programs in Europe require that you have multiple countries on a proposal. And they are sort of due to the politics of how the European Commission, the European Union gets the funding from the donor countries. But what the side effect of that is that you have this incredible sort of collaborative community because of the requirements that are put on them to work together on addressing the science problems. And so I really love, sort of the way that the funding structure there sort of forced these partnerships to happen. And again, that's been going on for at least 20 years. And so it's really sort of embedded in the culture of how science is done in Europe.
Yeah. And I love, so I'm a policy nerd. I can't help it. I think it's really fascinating. And I love learning about, different, not just US policy, but different countries having different requirements. And, one of the big things I've noticed over the years is just the collaboration with the scientific community. The gap when you finish doing your research to when policy gets implemented has narrowed a bit. And I don't know if you've seen differences in those approaches. So how quickly policy updates in Europe versus the US, for example, have you seen changes between the two? Or are they both moving in a direction where we get to the science sooner and we get to changes in policy sooner as well?
Well, so I think this spring or this summer, the European Commission have been negotiating over the target for how much CO2 natural ecosystems should remove from the atmosphere by 2030, maybe 2050. I'm not entirely sure, but within some time frame. So they're actually developing a specific policy with a specific number of sort of like million metric tons of CO2 that is expected to be reached as part of sort of the net zero targets that they have. And so that obviously requires the science community to be sort of making those calculations that then get used to support the policy. That's like a synergy, at least on the natural sort of ecosystem side, that I haven't seen play out in the US. I think things in the US on oil and gas emissions of methane, there's been some amazing sort of developments in the last 2 to 3 years with the private sector developing technologies to detect methane leaks from oil and gas. And then these technologies then feeding into updating policies that the EPA and the US government can develop then to stop those leaks from happening in the first place. And so I think that's probably the most exciting sort of climate related synergy between what's happening on the science, technology, and policy is through detection of methane leaks and preventing those.
Very, very cool. And Ben, I want to keep asking you 1,000 more questions, but I know you've got plenty of other things to work on. So before we let you go, is there anything we didn't get to touch on that you'd like to bring up?
No, I think it's been great to sort of have a discussion, share some of the experiences I've had in my career. I think this is the other sort of thing I look for recruiting people is that, this is really like an all hands on deck sort of situation with the climate crisis. And so we need people from all, sort of walks of life to get involved and get educated and look for solutions. And so I'm always happy to sort of connect with people and chat and provide advice.
Yeah, which is really, really great. And for all those listening, where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so if you Google my name and NASA, you'll find my NASA website. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can find me through my name and NASA. And then I also have a Twitter handle, which is Ben Poulter. So CarbenPoulter.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here, Ben.
All right. Thank you.
And that's our show. Thank you, Ben, so much for being here today. Please be sure to check us out each and every Friday. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. See ya, everybody. Bye.